joining us here tonight. I think it's going to be a really interesting evening. Just to give you an idea of what's going to happen, first off, we're going to ask investigative journalist and author Stephen Gray to say a few remarks to give some context to the evening. Then we're going to have a panel debate. One of the panelists is running late, so she'll probably join us once it's got started. So I'll just kick off with some questions to the panel. Then lots of questions and comments from you guys, I hope, on this really interesting subject. After the debate, we have I'm a photojournalist. Tim Hetherington is going to say a few words and announce the Index Tim Hetherington Trust Liverpool John Moores Fellowship, present that. And at the end, though by no means the least, David Aronovich, Index board chair, is going to finish up with a few words. And then you're all invited, if you would like to join us in going on to a very exciting film premiere post-party. If you'd like to go on to that, the Index staff at the end of the evening will give you directions on how to get there. So we hope some of you will come along to that. So I'm just going to kick off by reading something that made me think about the context of what we're doing today. It's from Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich. Her words were translated in the last few days, just after she was given the award. She said, "Not long ago, we were romantics. We sat in our kitchens, sang songs by Soviet bards of the 60s and 70s, and dreamed of freedom. But no one had any idea what freedom was. And no one knew what the people wanted. Did they really want freedom, or did they just want to be better off? With a Schengen visa, a second-hand foreign car, and holidays in Egypt by the Red Sea, and 20 different kinds of sausage and cheese. And that's what they call freedom? The last 20 years have sobered us up. We naive heralds of perestroika now understand that the road to freedom is a long one, that we all need as much courage as during the days of communism, or perhaps still more." So there are just some thoughts to get us going. Without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Stephen Gray. Stephen.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for inviting me tonight to take part in this discussion. First, a little secret. Last time I was here, my last dealing with Index on Censorship was a few years ago, when I was talking to Julian Assange, who was then in Sweden, and we were making a documentary about the Iraq war logs, and wondering how we would allow him to come into Britain without getting blocked on the way in. And then we had the idea of calling Index on Censorship and inviting him to a debate. So, because we thought, no, the British government would never stop someone coming to a censorship debate in Britain. And anyway, he's still here, actually. so it sort of worked. But Assange and WikiLeaks, in a way, embodied the passionate feelings we feel, and conflicted feelings many of us feel either way about censorship. And people still have tremendous worries about whether this was damaging or not to just release absolutely everything in the way WikiLeaks did. And yet the river of information that's come out of WikiLeaks and subsequently Snowden in a more restricted way is just one facet of this explosion of free knowledge and rapid messaging that defines our world today, and to which I think our politics and our security services as well have yet to adapt. And it's hard to know, really, and when you read this brilliant magazine that Rachel, you produced, to know whether censorship and freedom have really, on balance, changed over the years. And perhaps it's meaningless, really, to sort of try to score that. But certainly, things have moved on. The battlefront has moved on to a new dimension. The way in which people express themselves and the way that censorship is organised has changed quite dramatically. On the one hand, we do have an age of openness and transparency. We have people writing constantly their opinions and innermost thoughts, and sometimes their every movements on public digital walls. And that popularity of social media provides strength. It means it can be hard to censor the news, at least initially. States are struggling desperately to catch up. And things have changed in that way. In China, there were tens of millions killed in the Great Famine between 59 and 61, and kept secret for absolutely years. And now the media, when you have accidents, as we saw in the city of the explosion in Tianjin the other day, the media does report how many people die, at least in the early period. And in Russia, where there is great effective censorship, we've seen the Russian media taking the lead in exposing the presence of Russian troops secretly within Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. But it's always a game of cat and mouse, and I think that alongside this age of openness is an age of somehow transient freedom, where truth sometimes feels like a sort of flickering image that comes in and out, and sometimes is snuffed out. The message is sometimes lost, drowned out by so much noise of social media and people expressing themselves. And also the way that which we express ourselves by using wires and electronic means to communicate so often, it makes us vulnerable to the switch suddenly being pulled, to being free one day and then hearing nothing and being alone the other. An article in this magazine describes how in China exemplifies this sort of flickering freedom, where at one point a documentary on air pollution is promoted even by the official organs of the Communist Party, and then all of a sudden, even across the millions of messages on Chinese social media and Weibo, all mention has disappeared. And even in India, where also written about, where we tend to think of it as very free. We've had very important films and a key documentary, India's Daughter, gaining great traction, and all of a sudden being banned from public view. I think that in a dictatorship, what we're seeing is how a smattering, a little amount of dissonant noise is tolerated. It's almost welcomed. People want to know, even dictators want to know roughly what's going on. They use corruption as a weapon in their own internal disputes, and the press sometimes helps them in providing the details. But they swoop, as they have in Iran, as soon as there's evidence that dissident noise is going to reach the masses. In Russia, it's okay to have Nova Gazetia, low circulation, intellectual-driven paper, but independent mass television and independent NTV is not to be allowed. And then the other side, as well as this age of transient freedom, we also have an age of mass surveillance. All those messages, all that communication is there to be mined and monitored, to cast this huge net. It's possible to opt now, the technology is there for almost total surveillance. You can actually record every country. It's being shown by some activists how you could record the phone call of every sort of compressed way of every call in some countries, and store that information, a year's phone calls of everyone in the country, in a storage device the size of a phone box, a shoebox. So you can't listen to all those calls, and contrary to some people's views, there is not the capacity or interest by state security agencies to monitor everybody all the time. But it's deterrence enough to know that if you are caught in the spotlight, if you are suddenly the object of the state's attention, whether in China or in Great Britain, it's quite chilling to know the amount of information that can be unearthed about you, and not just you, but all your friends and contacts who can be identified and punished. I recently spoke to an Angolan journalist who many of you may know, Rafael Marques, who described how he sometimes has to wait a year when he receives some sensitive document before he publishes it, just so the trace between him, this social network that emerges, and the trace between him and his contact can go cold. So there's the sort of landscape, and I suppose many of us still feel quite conflicted at where we stand exactly in these issues. We know we want to stand for freedom of expression, but we're horribly conflicted when we look at the application of this. Some censorship does seem logical when we want to prevent people and our children being drawn into gangs or seeing violent pornography or being lured into going off to Syria, being part of these terrorist movements. And we've seen in the magazine how South Korea has actually introduced an application that's compulsory for all kids to censor their the content that they might be viewing. But the tools that are being developed work both ways. A tool that we welcome that's developed to keep dissidents freely operating in Russia and China, things like PGP or Tor or Open Whisper, encrypted phone calls, these tools are very much being adopted at the same time by gangsters, by paedophiles, or by ISIS. And by the same token, tools developed to track those criminals, to monitor free speech in cyberspace, are being exported to help dictators. As we've seen, every time a dictator falls, we find all the evidence of how Western companies are helping them to monitor their citizens. And in this landscape, mathematicians are becoming warriors. Encryption is at the heart of so many struggles for freedom at the moment, and I don't think computer scientists will anyway be able to call themselves neutral in the way that physicists couldn't call themselves neutral in the arms race. But still, I think when it comes to fighting censors, as Angola's Moraes was saying the other day, ultimately more important than technical tools still remains what Gandhi called truth firmness, standing up against repression, and explaining why he doesn't alter his behavior despite this intense surveillance on him. He said, one of the things that repressive regimes do is use fear, and you have to lift that fear. You have to remain strong, and that's why he doesn't change the way he behaves. So I know those are the contexts, and I know we'll debate these issues. I'll just throw one idea into the mix, which is that it's the idea of strategic patience. I think when an idea gets widely held, just like the philosophy of violent Islamism, I think it's a pipe dream to imagine it can be defeated by censorship or technical measures. It has to be defeated by some kind of antithesis that challenges and defeats its message. And I think perhaps what unites those who believe in freedom of expression is a faith that somehow the same mechanism of free speech that can spread an evil message will also spread the antidote, the idea that can purge that evil. So thank you very much, and that's the opening thoughts.
There's some seats at the front, so if anybody doesn't want to sit on the floor, there are a couple of seats in the front row, a couple of seats in the second row, so don't feel that you have to sit on the floor unless you want to. And there's
Two here.
so yeah, there are plenty. So do come forward and take a seat if you would like to. If you'd like to sit on the floor, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. I just wanted to say for housekeeping as well, the hashtag tonight is Index Frontline. So if anyone's tweeting, please do use that. That would be great. So as I mentioned before, one of our panelists is slightly delayed, so she may join us along the way. So I'll just mention who the other panelists are. So Stephen Gray, author of the new book, The New Spymasters, also an award-winning British investigative journalist. On the left, you've already heard from Ismail Anishi, who's has been a BBC producer, journalist, writer, has many strings to his bow as well. On my far right, Robert McCrum, associate editor of The Observer, long-time writer and supporter of Index, also previously editor-in-chief of Faber and Faber. Both Ishmael and Robert regularly write for the magazine, so thank you very much for that. So welcome to them all. Zhao Zhuo will be joining us hopefully along the way, and she's a Chinese novelist and author. So if I can just kick off the debate tonight by asking all of you, as Stephen touched on there, some of the issues, censorship, subterfuge and propaganda, are those challenges greater or less than they were in previous decades? Ishmael, I wonder if you could.
Yeah, sure.
begin.
Thinking about a piece that I wrote for Index, I think it was an issue on refugees, about Eritrea, where I'm quite interested in. I think there's also places like Eritrea and many countries in Africa, indeed, censorship has increased. Official censorship, state censorship, and also you have a situation where, in Eritrea particularly, that people are fleeing a very closed-off country, which is very isolated. That when people leave and they come to Europe, I've met people in Italy, in the Netherlands, and so on, who speak of how the states, even though they've left this very closed-off, sort of isolated states, sort of Africa's North Korea, that the state's still able to reach them in the West, that people get censored, that people don't feel they can speak. A gentleman I interviewed for the piece for Index, for example, said that leaving Eritrea was leaving a physical prison, but actually going to a psychological imprisonment, in the sense that the state had the power to follow you even if you left this very sort of brutal, isolated state. I think one of the points that Stephen was making at the very end about Raphael was the way in which fear is used by the state. And as we've seen, particularly, I know, particularly in the context in Africa where I spend quite a bit of time, you see the increase in education, the increase in sort of development means that the state is actually able to use censorship and use that fear to hold people back in. So, for example, when Raphael won his award for journalism at the Index Awards, he mentioned Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is, a country of 100 million. It's an ancient culture. Obama visited in July, yet it's a terrible record for human rights. It jails journalists. It also currently, so almost a year and a half now, where a group of bloggers, Zone 9 bloggers they're known as, were arrested along with 3 other journalists for terrorism by the state, and they're held still in prison. So you see this sort of, to answer your question, is it more or less? I don't, in this context in Africa, I think actually you see that there's increasing censorship, and that has to be tied in with the kind of decline in democracy. Freedom House, for example, says that the democratic sort of gains you had in the continent in the early 2000s have now reversed. So what you have is a situation where things are becoming less democratic, states are becoming less free. In fact, I think Mauritius is the only state in Africa considered to be full a democracy, whereas the rest are partial or hybrid or none. And so this, question is an important one, but I think in the context in Africa particularly, there's censorship increasing, and also at home, because I think often, it's important not just to focus on censorship in far away places, there's also censorship here in Britain. And there's also, we think about, for example, the Homegrown, the play, the National Youth Theatre, for example. That was an example. Mariam Namazi, who's a human rights activist, who was, barred from speaking at Warwick University. Julie Bindel. There's a Swedish Somali journalist, Amun Abdullahi, who was reporting for the Swedish equivalent of BBC World Service, and she had some uncomfortable truths about radicalization in her community in Stockholm. But the radio station didn't like it, so they censored her. So, you see that as well, the censorship happening even in the West.
Robert, what do you think? You've been involved in this world, in this fight for a long time.
Yeah, I think there is always censorship. And may I say before we start, thank you all for coming. I mean, if I could have imagined in 1978, when I first joined this magazine, that we'd be in a room with, 200 people, 250 people discussing this, it would have seemed like a dream. We were so hand to mouth. And we lived by, I was saying to David, who's in the front here, we lived by the skin of our teeth all the time. We were always moving offices, we had no money, there was a skeleton staff, very, very devoted, and so it's fantastic you're all here. But I think the big difference between then and now is that in those days it was simple. With the Cold War, and you knew who the enemy was, you knew what the enemy did, and the enemy knew who you were, and also it was a split between essentially a shared culture. And what's different now is the culture is more diverse, much more scattered. It's global in the way it used to be European. It's global, involving Africa and China and India and parts of the world which many of us are not familiar with in the way that we are familiar with, say, Hungary or Czechoslovakia or Poland. So the big change, in my mind, is this extraordinary explosion of global consciousness to do with censorship. And I think that's where we get into trouble. That's where it gets difficult. And it's where the thinking can get a bit fuzzy. And that's the issue I'd like to think about today. Is this magazine was founded by Stephen Spender and David Astor and Tom Stoppard. These were the guys who I used to sit around the table with in 1970. It's an incredibly impressive bunch. They were trying to defend literary freedom in the Cold War, and now we're trying to defend freedom of speech and freedom of thought and expression across the globe, and that's the big difference.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts about the global nature of spying, of subterfuge, of propaganda, censorship, and what difference that makes in terms of kind of fighting against it? Easy question there.
Well, I think the tools, I mean, I just think there's an arms race of censorship and expression. If you look at one of the freedoms that people cherish is the idea of being able to communicate privately to each other, and they do so in a digital way now, and people are trying to intercept them on a mass scale, and they're responding with encryption and different techniques of doing so. But it's always been like that, in the sense that there's been whole periods where, for example, all of the Soviets' communications were listened to, and then whole periods when it all went dark and they had no idea what was going on. We had many spy cases, but the truth is that there were very few successful spies in the Cold War. They produced partial information. For most of the Cold War, much of the Soviet Union was what they would call the dark side, referred to as the dark side of the moon, where people were operating without information. I suppose the only thing I would say that relatively different, apart from all the technology, is perhaps this sense of disillusion in many places that have tasted freedom, which is another where there isn't this sort of thirst to beat the censorship, because in a way the technology allows you so many ways to find things out if you're in a situation to get around this sort of local censorship where people don't actually bother. So I mean, I spent quite a lot of time in Russia recently, and there's a place where democracy feels for most people as something that went wrong, and where yes, the mass media has been heavily censored, but information is still available to those that want it, but it's not much sought out, and that is a complete contrast to under the iron, certainly in the sort of when you go from the sort of 70s, 80s, more about where, although the censorship was that much more severe, people put the signals together and found ways, and they had a thirst to find out what was going on. So the disillusion of freedom, and you see the same in some countries in the Middle East, is another sort of context for that, for why it's different.
I don't know if you have thoughts about that one, Ishmael, in terms of government's ability to suppress all knowledge, like we've seen in, to some extent Ethiopia, but also Eritrea, so that people, can't learn about what's going on outside their own country, and how effective that is. I think our other panelists might have arrived. Come on up whenever you want to. That's yeah. Don't worry. Well, hopefully you threw them off, which is excellent. So,
running from the airport.
Big welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. and don't worry, we won't ask you a question straight away. Sorry.
Yeah, I think certainly. If you, I think that is tied very much to the situation in a given country. So, for example, if you're talking about Eritrea, only 6% of the population has access to the internet. In Ethiopia, it's impossible to do really simple things like get a SIM card. It took me 3 days last year to get a SIM card in Ethiopia, and I had to go through this whole intense process of documentation and speaking to somebody and so on. So it's actually very difficult. So that might be the story in Eritrea and Ethiopia, but in other parts of Africa, telecommunications are very easily available. So I think if people have the state has the means and is able to enforce that within a given territory, then of course that infringes on, they can censor, and that infringes on freedom of expression. But I want to just maybe go back a little bit to the sort of back and today, sort of the past and now. I think one of the things it's really interesting for me is, I think Robert was talking about this, the way in which technology has shifted things. So I travel quite a bit back home, Somalia, and the differences are quite amazing. So in the 80s, my parents were political activists, anti-government activists, and they, the way the state dealt with them was very simple. It essentially, arrested people, it used hard power, used violence. People were thrown into prison, tortured, and so on. And now the technology means that increasingly what you have is, particularly in African context, it's such a young population, is that people are using things like Viber and WhatsApp and all other kinds of e-platforms to be able to bypass the capacity and the ability of states to be able to enforce censorship. And in fact, in African context, most states don't have the capacity, or because they're incompetent, or because they don't have the sophisticated kind of technology needed. So that's what's changed. And I think the next phase might be, some states are increasingly beginning to acquire the means, the capacity to be able to enforce censorship online and in the telecommunications spheres.
That moves me on to a question that I wanted to ask before I bring everybody else in, which was to all of you really, which is technological advances. I mean, who are they giving the power to? Robert, maybe come to you and then Shirley.
Sorry, the question.
Technological advances, who have they given the power to, in your opinion?
Well, if I go back to my days in Index at the beginning, if I wanted to get a copy of the magazine, or copies of the magazine to somewhere like Czechoslovakia, you got on the train and you went with a bunch of bananas because there was a shortage of fruit and vegetables. And so my first trip to Prague was with a carrier bag of bananas and a copy of Index and Censorship and some manuscripts, typescripts in fact, for certain writers in Prague. So I think the big change must be the freedom of transmission. I mean the laborious ways in which we had to go through to get stuff from A to B were excruciating in contemporary terms.
Shirley, what do you think? I mean, it's not all one way, is it? I mean, technology can be used in different ways.
I mean, because the internet, I come from China, so I can perhaps speak, for me, the state control, the state surveillance is such a daily event. It's day-to-day reality you have to live with as Chinese in China. But I think the internet has a great advantage as well because of the decentralized power. There's no one boss in the internet world. There's many control, but through different government. And the purpose is very different. So since the internet started in China 20 years ago, it created great freedom, much bigger freedom than before, but also it promoted a much bigger or overwhelming state control because at the moment, I think at least there's 2 million internet police working in mainland China, at least. And the situation is because in China you cannot register with fake name, fake address. You have to register with your real ID card. Everyone has ID card, not a passport. So that situation is you submit yourself to the absolute authority once you register your names. And so the idea of dissident is totally changed. So 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, a Chinese dissident is someone involved in the real revolution or wrote some kind of public article in a manifesto, and then they will be exiled in the West. But nowadays, a Chinese dissident meaning cyber dissident. So they will never left China, or they are in a Chinese jail in mainland, but they were distant because they're not allowed to write, to come out again, within the society. So the cyber control is really, it's a vast, is kind of, I think, the biggest control. But again, as I said, the internet has kind of decentralized the control. So you can always get by, from, for example, you can register your name in America, then you can work in China as a Chinese. But again, it's also very dodgy because between America and China, the Chinese government would buy the routers, hundreds of thousands of routers from America, which means a supposed American internet website looks like very free. You can do all the free talk there, but actually is bought by Chinese government, and it eventually is controlled in China. So that's a very dodgy situation. Yeah.
And it's always changing, isn't it? I mean, Jemima Steinfeld, who we both know, wrote for the magazine on how people were using new apps to get around the firewall, the Great Firewall, and it would work for a couple of weeks, and then that would get found out, and then people would move on to the next thing.
Exactly. The Chinese internet control is really, I think, one of the most advanced one. And it's not new. I don't think it's any one particular country has the most control, but it's global scale. Every government does that. I just flew from Switzerland, half an hour ago, but in Switzerland there's a big scandal because Max Fischer, the most famous Swiss writer, who already died, but eventually he published a book about in Switzerland during the Cold War, supposed to be the most peaceful country, but from the Cold War to 1990s, 1 million Swiss citizens under the state surveillance, and that's Switzerland is supposed to be neutral and peaceful. So then when I fly over to here, I was thinking, well, there's nowhere is safe, yet we are a part of that submission too, because we are on the internet. There's no other way to live, beyond the internet.
Stephen, we've seen governments bring in their own specialists in social media to sort of create counter speech and do things that I guess when Twitter was invented, when the internet was invented, no one was expecting it to be used this way by governments to close down journalism, to close down or to change people's, attack people's reputations. I mean, we didn't see all this coming, did we?
No, although, the government propaganda as a sort of covert propaganda has always been there. One of the facets of the Cold War was how popular the sort of middle left of Western Europe was heavily subsidized. Trade union movements, left parties were heavily subsidized for many years by the CIA as a counter to communism. What Russia points out quite rightly is the way in which around its borders sort of soft revolutions have been heavily promoted again as another form of covert action.
And in fact, Stephen Spender, who founded this magazine, was involved in a CIA-founded magazine.
Right.
So,
at least, I still think it's preferable to handing out weapons is to fund a propaganda outfit, because at least those ideas, subsidised or not, can be countered. But the technology and the freedom that the internet brings puts a fear of God into governments. I mean, whether in the UK or anywhere else, they're absolutely petrified by the maths, which is beyond their control. They can't change the laws of maths, and however good the boffins are of GCHQ or in China, they can't defeat some of the means that the internet provides, the networked world we're in, to let that sort of message out. And they are obviously spending fortunes to try and counter that freedom. The battle is, if you like, ongoing, and all the sort of threats that are out there, including the terrible threat from terrorism, and is being used in every country of the world as an excuse for sort of handing the state more powers. But I don't think that I think that the other side is too strong. I don't think that it's possible technically to do the kind of things they want to. And I mean, I'm interested in hearing more about China, but the clearly you see that, I was saying before you arrived, there's a sort of flashes of information that comes out. It's stamped down, but before it's stamped down, the message, I assume by most people in China, people have got the message before the government is able to react and sort of clamp down on that message. You see so many things that just sort of flicker up. And I guess we all have to sort of, in those places, you just have to interpret yourself as to what's going on there.
Now I want to bring in the audience because I'm sure you've all got interesting things to say. We also have some amazing people who were involved in Index from the very beginning, who might want to comment on change themselves, including Philip Spender, who's in the front row, but might want to contribute. But so, does anyone have either a question or a comment? Let's take a few from this audience. Do we have a mic? Yeah. So David's going to bring the mic. So there's a woman right at the back on the high chairs. Let's start with her, and then we'll come to you as well.
Jacqueline Peach from AFP. Thank you very much for the debate. You've spoken a lot about governments and states, but would you like to say something about companies, private companies, and how they bring pressure on individual people and individual reporting, not only in countries such as Eritrea or China or India, but also here in Europe? I mean, you have newspapers that are taken over by industrial groups, and you have journalists resigning en masse. Here in the Telegraph, the political commentator resigning because he felt that the coverage of HSBC was partial, because these groups have impact on the financial flows of journalism and media organizations.
Okay, and then just here.
John White from the FT. It is a fairly obvious point, but it's one that struck me a lot looking at Russia, which is the foreign country I know best, and that is how popular censorship is. In this sense, that the regime in Russia has developed a series of strategies, mainly for television, which are highly nationalistic, are hugely propagandist, are very often entirely mendacious, especially about Ukraine, but people like it. And even though the country is now going through an economic decline, Putin remains very popular, in very large part, I think, because he's been able to embed a narrative of Russian success, of Russia being wounded and a threat from the West, especially from America, and that Russia is a separate Eurasian culture. And as I say, he's getting 80 to 90% of support, and the television and films, which are now extremely well made and have copied American patriotic blockbusters and taken it a stage further, are hugely popular. So that if you like, the liberal media struggles to be heard.
Yeah. Okay, let's take one more. Just swivel slightly, David. There's somebody just next to you.
Hi there. My name's Hannah, and I was one of a group of Irish students who invited Nick Griffin to speak at an immigration debate about 4 or 5 years ago. I was involved in the debating union. I'm not a tosser, I promise. But in your opening remarks, Stephen, you talked a little bit about the politicization of science and of communications technology. But I was wondering if you could all talk a little bit about the politicization of free speech as well, in as much as we do often exclude voices, quite rightly, for reasons of hate speech, racism, homophobia, what have you, but we do exclude those voices. We choose to exclude them, and they're often the ones that we most wish would take up this more liberal narrative. So I was wondering if you could all talk a little bit about where you draw those lines, because we do draw them, we all draw them, and how you go about creating a moral compass around a free speech narrative.
Okay, so 3 interesting areas. Company, corporate pressure, Russia, the popularity of censorship that John Lloyd was talking about, and excluding speakers, excluding voices that should be heard, but part of the debate. Stephen, do you want to pick one of those or some of them?
Corporate pressure. I spent quite a long time, last few years, reporting around in Eastern Europe and particularly in Greece. And there's an example where, I don't think untypical, where with the media under pressure, with funding cut and the economy in difficulties, the media has been absolutely silenced by business and by the most powerful interests in the country. And all the laws and freedoms exist. People are free to sort of write what they want. But the newspapers are absolutely hand to mouth and television to their owners, and also to those who provide the advertisements, who are simply the financial institutions, the banks, the very people who are most to be scrutinised most at the moment. And it's quite incredible. I mean, the measure of that really, and you see that in many places, when you go and talk to journalists and you hear these incredible stories, and they pass them to you because they cannot get them published in their own countries. And I suppose if it weren't for the fact that there is now this alternative media, so much would be suppressed.
Do you think more so than the past? Because it's not like corporate pressure wasn't there historically.
So I do think more so than in the past, because I don't think that I think that social movements have been destroyed in many of these countries, so that actually there is not the sort of funding that exists outside the private sector to fund a lot of research and media, perhaps as it was in the past. The decline, for example, of ironically state broadcasting, has taken away another independent voice, and obviously it goes hand in hand with economic crisis. That the more the country, the less money they have, the more they are dependent on key people who finance things. And you see that in this country, where the advertising is obviously not supposed to influence anything. Now if everything's internet advertising, you can actually buy the advert that goes against the story that that someone else is trying to write against you, which is a complete breach of all sort of advertising and newspaper principles. But you can see that on a daily basis.
So
I'm interested, maybe the last question I thought about the internet censorship and, for example, all this hate speech, the abusive message on the blog, on the internet, the commentary, on the News Guardian, all this. Because I'm thinking, do we have, there's internet censorship, obviously, in most of the major websites. But so who is doing that, and at what degree the censorship should be? Because in China, the censorship works hand in hand with internet control. So the difference is in the West, you can write whatever you want on those blogs, on the messages. Maybe no one delete you. You can write quite awful stuff. But the difference in China is within some seconds, or within minutes, those abusive language or so-called anti-state speech will be deleted very quickly by the internet censorship or internet police. And that's the difference, between the two systems. So someone from, like me from China, I always believe censorship should exist in every single country, certain censorship on every media, that, of course, my speech will be laughed. What, you mean censorship? I say yes, because how do we deal with abusive stuff, the crazy stuff on the internet? So at what degree this should exist? And how transparent that censorship in the internet, who is doing that? And do we have clear law, in front of every citizen? You can read this, and then this is not going to be posted. Otherwise, you get punishment. Because that is clear in China, kind of clear, but never clear, of course. Anyway, I'm interested in that. Yeah.
Okay, Robert, do you want to pick up any of the?
Yeah, I'll take the last one. I'll take your. I have an old-fashioned view, which is I think freedom is indivisible. You can't be a little bit free. You're either free or you're not. And freedom is a messy business, and it causes trouble. And having said that, I sort of feel actually the present situation makes me question my own belief in the indivisibility of freedom. And it goes to John's point, which is you have freedom, and you suddenly find you've got people whose opinions you don't really like very much. But to me, that's what it's all about. But it's a while. This is a European tradition. I completely respect the Chinese inheritance, so to speak, but it's very difficult. And clearly, part of the difficulty with this debate is there are different competing traditions at odds with each other in different parts of the world. But certainly in Europe, I think freedom is indivisible.
But what about this point from the audience here about?
So I would say everyone should has the right to express themselves. I know that's a risky thing to say, but I think everyone has the right to say whatever they want to say, however intolerable that is. I would fight for that.
Do you worry about the fact that some people don't like
absolutely
are being deplatformed?
I do worry about it. I worry about paedophiles. I worry about hate speech. I worry about
a lot of things.
All these things. But I think what's interesting, if I may broaden this even further, if you go back to 1600, when Shakespeare was writing, and there was a similar splurge in the print media in the 60s. The writers of that time expressed exactly this is in English terms, not global terms or European terms. In England, there was a big debate about the freedom of the pamphlets and the magazines and the squibs and the folios, all this stuff. So this has been around for a hell of a long time. It's very profound, and it's one of those things which the Puritans, in fact, ultimately was taken up by Milton in Areopagitica, which is a great statement of all this. But it doesn't go away. So I think we're living in a debate which has been rumbling on for a hell of a long time.
Always read your history. Ishmael.
Also to pick up on the lady's question from Ireland, I think, as I said at the beginning, that there are many instances in Britain where people have been, no platform, where they have been censored, where their freedom of expression has been curtailed. I mentioned Mariam Namazi, who was recently refused to speak at Warwick University because people didn't like what she said. Or there is, I mentioned the Swedish Somali journalist, or there is Sharia Khatun in Tower Hamlets. There was a well-known, well-liked local councillor who faced attacks, violence, and intimidation because people didn't like the way she dressed. So I think there are many instances in Britain and across Europe where those who do speak and who do say things that are uncomfortable, who take on things that are sacred, are in fact silenced. And I think also, counter to that, there's also this very insidious and dangerous sort of self-censorship, which I think I was sort of mentioning the example of Homegrown as well, where people don't publish things, where people don't talk about things because it might offend people, because it might be culturally sensitive and so on. Whereas I agree with Robert, I think freedom is absolute. Of course, there are extremes, and there are people that we have to ensure that they can't incite hatred and so on, but it has to absolutely be indefensible. And I think often, in the last few years in Europe, you've seen this pattern where people are either self-censoring. There's this sort of social media kind of storm that comes when people don't say you say something that people don't like, and I think we've forgotten actually it's important to have debate, it's important to talk, and we shouldn't be censoring people. And just to also, if I might pick up that gentleman's point about Russia, I think so. For example, I was reading editorial from today's Zaman, which is a paper in Istanbul, and the editor was sent down. He's in prison in Istanbul because he sent a tweet which offended President Erdogan. And it is interesting why censorship is popular, as you said. In Russia, it is popular. Is that because people don't have the information in Russia, or because people really like censorship? I don't think it's because people like censorship. I think often it's because people don't have the information to make informed choices. So what you've got to talk about is also about education and about information and people knowing what's going on. A final thing I'll say is also just in the context of where censorship takes place, which I think is really important, is about democracy. And it's obvious that to have a fully democratic state, therefore people like to have less censorship probably. And what we've seen is a reversal of that trend, particularly in Africa, which is very worrying. And also people are sort of very tired of it. Whenever I travel in East Africa, people go, ugh, don't talk to me about democracy. It's sort of in the West. It's not. I'm not interested in it. We're interested in economic development. So again, it's that sort of China model of sort of saying, well, we deliver you bread, and education, but you forget about rights. Whereas I think both go in tangent.
Okay, let's get some more views, thoughts, comments. Where's David? Oh, there's one. Maybe you want to take one here. We'll come over here in a sec.
Jonathan Price, Doughty Street Chambers. I was interested in something Stephen said in his introductory remarks when he invoked the nuclear physicists from the 40s and 50s and said that computer scientists today, like the nuclear physicists, could no longer be morally neutral. And it got me thinking about the people for whom a lot of these computer scientists work. And the cream of these are employed by Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And it's those corporations that cannot be morally neutral. Frequently, censorship is achieved through internal policies and takedown procedures of these multinational corporations, who are far more powerful and insidious than any government. And censorship now operates at that corporate level It's implemented through the data scientists and the computer scientists, but it's not those people in whom we need to find a morality, but it's the corporations that employ them. That's my point. It's also a question because I'd be interested to hear the views of the panel.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple over here. And then there's a guy at the back who I know wants to ask a question.
Hi, William Morland from Palantir Technologies. One of the biggest trends that I've seen recently, well, for a while now, is that trend from centralized media or publishing to Twitter, Facebook, people hosting their own blogs. And I'm curious how optimistic you are as to that being a force against controlled media elsewhere, because we have examples like the Arab Spring, which people point to saying that, you know, it's this massive force against it, but then at the same time, there's a risk of people creating their own filter bubbles and reading the media that they want to on the internet rather than the media that's necessarily telling them the truth. For example, in Saudi Arabia, they have the highest proportion of population on Twitter, and that's used as a vent, as a way for people to kind of like complain about the little things, but they know that they can't complain about the big things.
Okay. And there's a guy in a check shirt, David, right at the back by the bar.
I want to agree with Ismail about the cultural installed censorship, because where I come from, there is two subjects that you don't write about. Well, you didn't used to write about, because in print, nobody likes it. Nobody liked it. It's church and homosexuality. I'm from Armenia. Armenian Voice, we have a small magazine. Now, you don't write about sexuality, homosexuality, and you don't write anything against the church on print. But because of technology, now if we go out and write on the internet what we think, what we believe that the church is doing wrong, or what is homosexuality, try to explain to people, you do get the positives back. So the creation of the technology has created a lesser, but still a hidden freedom against censorship. But the censorship still exists, because I cannot put my words in print and give it to people to read about homosexuality and what I think about what is the church doing. But if I write about the oligarchs, which is more dangerous for me as a writer, well, they'll be happy about that. It doesn't matter if I get shot in the street, but they do agree with me that, you know, the oligarchs are taking over the economy, or, you know, whatever. So end of the day, we have certainly, definitely a cultural censorship which will carry on in some cultures forever for certain subjects. And you cannot, I don't think, change that. It might change gradually, but it's very difficult to change it, because of the new technology.
Okay. So the power of big corporations, filtering our own news, choosing filters or not, or news being filtered for us, and self-censorship, and the difficulty of covering some subjects in terms of possible threats. Would you like to kick off?
I think it's all come back to the idea of freedom, as we said before. The freedom, and I lost trust. The independent spirit of the media, especially the big media, the bigger, the more dodgier, because the power has to be accumulated by losing its own integrity, and that. In that sense, like when I say, of course, the good censorship should be there, because it's nearly, I'm cynical about really do you think there's freedom? Although poetically, romantically, we're pursuing freedom. Centuries, thousands of years, humanity pursuing that. But what we have is the massively discounted freedom handed over by some co-op or some state control. And we have limited freedom, either in the West or in the East is 20% of freedom. And what are we talking about? We no longer talk about freedom. We talk about how a media can be truly independent. And is that absolutely impossible to be independent? And if it's absolutely impossible for a major media to be independent, so what do we do as trivial individual? How do we contribute that? How do we build something, with some trust? I don't have any trust on those media. So then now I'm talking about censorship because it's just like it's totally cynical.
Okay. Ishmael, do you want to pick up one of those points?
Yeah, sure. I'll pick up the gentleman from Armenia's point. I think you are right. Of course, it's very difficult if you're in a situation like in Armenia where it's difficult to find the platforms to be able to publish. But as you say, there are tools that we can use, whether it's social media, whether it's blogging, the internet. We can use to be able to kind of connect with each other. I think it kind of relates to the point that the gentleman at the front was also making about Saudi Arabia, which is interesting, which I didn't know. But, you know, you mentioned Tahrir Square or the Arab Spring, and there was such hope, wasn't there? And then, you know, look where it got to. You know, the tanks were sent in. You know, the old way of, you know, sorting things out. You know, the brute force, you know, violence. So social media has to work in tangent with social movements. So yes, it's great that we have blogging webs, you know, that we have, you know, e-technology, that we can go on Twitter. But if we don't have the social movement to back it up, and if we don't have brave people fighting for these things, then it's often very difficult to see any changes happening, I think.
Stephen, would you pick up that point about news filters? I don't know. You know, about the news being filtered for us, sometimes without our knowledge, so that we only see some stories.
Absolutely. I mean, but we tend to filter for the audience, and newspapers had to always sell, and they've always filtered to provide people what they thought they wanted to hear, necessarily rather than what was actually going on. I think that to pick up the corporate point as well, let's not forget that the real mass surveillance that's taking place has been taking place within corporations. The big data is held by Google and Facebook. Much greater degree of data mining and commoditization of the individual is going on within the big corporations than it is at a state level. The other corporate mechanism is just what I referred to earlier, this sort of censorship by crowding out. You referred to in Russia, in that there is this John Lloyd refers to in Russia, this messaging that is paid for in the interests of the bottom line of corporations and of the interests of the state, and it's all very powerful. I mean, all the people that I'd say 10% of the people that started off in journalism with me, quite idealistic, are still there, and about 50% of them have gone off into advertising and pushing those corporate messages. And there is a where I maybe disagree with some people. On one point is that there is a clash between accountability and transparency and freedom sometimes. In that, I'd like to know where these messages are coming from. Sometimes I'd like to know the way in which journalists are being constantly fed stories. And more to the point, on the internet, I think the flip side of all the total openness of the internet and the ability to encrypt and all of that is that people stand up for what they do, and that I support measures to authenticate and provide more identity on the internet, because I think that anonymous hacking and anonymous vile kind of abuse that people suffer on social media and that kids suffer, has to be tracked down, so that there's a flip side where I do think you should stand up for what you do, and I think that and no doubt that is a balancing act against total freedom.
Robert, do you want to come in?
I think your point's really interesting, because I think there's a fault line in media between print and digital. I mean, let's face it, digital has been around for a generation. We're beginners in this business. We don't really know we're beginning to know how it works and what it does, and how it. And going to the point about the Arab Spring, everyone thought this was going to be the Twitter revolution, that Iran would change, the regime change in Iran through Twitter. Didn't happen. Well, if it did happen, it happened in a way which was not to do with Twitter, but only partly. And what you find with print is it has traction, because it involves individuals either handing print from A to B, or themselves engaging physically with the printed word on the page. And that is every newspaper in London in Britain is debating this issue at the moment. Times, Guardian, Telegraph. How to reconcile the old media with the fantastic opportunities, let's face it, fantastic of the new media, and with all the questions that follow in the train of this change. And these are very profound questions. It's what we're discussing. But I think, you know, and we're floundering because it's early days, is my feeling, and we're trying to find a way through this thicket of points of view clashing.
I think I've heard a lot of newspaper editors around the world talking about how surprised they were that print was still around, that the stickability of print, and that you know that they were still getting money from print advertising, and the predictions 10 years ago that
But what they've discovered
the readership would have gone
the last
completely.
8 months, the digital revenue has gone right down. It's gone to hit the floor, and suddenly there's a panic.
New York Times is still getting revenue from its print edition.
And also, we should say that Waterstones have now just stopped, as you probably know, stopped selling the Kindle. It may seem trivial, but it's all part of the same thing. There's something going on. I think there's something which we're not yet dealing with, but there's something going on with print.
I'm a big fan of print myself.
And if I may just finish the thought, this room is a celebration of live human engagement with ideas.
Okay.
I think that's fantastic, to me anyway.
I'm going to take two more quick points. One right at the front here. I can't remember the mic. And David, do you want to take the one with the glasses there, and then we'll come to the one at the front.
Thank you. This is an honor to be included in the two. I'm from Hungary, so my question will be accordingly about compromise. I would just like to tell you this little story that happened to me around a year ago. I don't know if we all know this, but all participants in the so-called Hungarian so-called media are extremely partisan. So partisanship is a basic quality there of all communication. And we have one so-called left-wing television channel left called ATV, where some traces of freedom of speech can be, with careful observation, observed. Where I was invited to speak about women's rights last year. And very interestingly, this last left-wing Hungarian television channel is owned by a Christian cult. So I was taken to the cafeteria and informed that they are very, very deeply devoted to the question of women's equality. However, I was not to be talking about homosexuality, abortion, or trans rights. Everything else was fine. So like the working mum was a preferred subject. And then I was sitting in the cafeteria drinking what they call coffee there and thinking, do I go home now? Or do I have to profit from like having one last island of left-wing television in my country? What do I do and what do I compromise before popularizing censorship like apparently Russian people do, or some of them. Thanks.
Thank you. And there's right at the front, just making you run around, David, completely.
I'd like to put a kind of toxic idea. James Thacker, I've consulted with 10 human rights groups since the early 70s. And various things that are being made here, points that are being made, or if you put them all together, you get something maybe slightly different. I have this argument with Ken Roth at Human Rights Watch. We have the morality enshrined in the Constitution, and we now have a First and Fourth Amendment crisis on. And this gentleman over here about physics is quite right. This began with the security screen at Los Alamos, and Mordecai Vanunu paid a hell of a price for it in Israel, 18 years of his life. Human Rights Watch wouldn't handle, they don't handle security oaths. For that reason, Snowden is in deep difficulty. And because this thing exists, and if you examine the intelligence codes and the secrecy codes of the Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, you'll see that there's a huge area of our society that is completely invisible to us. We here live in a state of innocence. The people in the NSA, they have 80 words that their algorithms pick up on. GCHQ has 170. Maybe this reflects the fact that we have a constitution and there's not one here. But the NSA is a work of art to these people. They don't need to be accountable to the Constitution, and they don't bother to be. Even when they know they're in the wrong, they proceed with this thing. They've created something. You mentioned the Soviet thing. I think the Soviets weren't able to pick up more than 100 or 200 people at a time. The NSA can pick up everybody, but they can't actually analyze them. So they're getting this massive information, and this creates an aura and an atmosphere and a world, dark world. It's called dark web. Google only operates in about 10% at the top of this thing. If you challenge the Google lawyers on this, they say, well, we wanted to have worldwide First Amendment, but now we've had 170 lawsuits in Europe. How are we ever going to get that? I think we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper into Fourth Amendment here, and there are lots and lots of horrible people hiding in the Fourth Amendment, and there are very few of us. So I would kind of disagree with you, Goshalu, because I think we have to take into account that we may, if you go to hacker symposiums, most hackers will say, if you want to avoid this thing, you just don't go on the web. I mean, we have to know how dangerous this thing is, actually. And I don't understand why there's not more defense of the First Amendment in all of these debates. I think we should be, Index, should be making a very, very strong front on this. And it is a fact that during the McCarthy hearings, people were advised in McCarthy not to plead the Fifth Amendment, to plead the First Amendment. The First Amendment is a powerful, powerful organ, and we're not defending it.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask the speakers to round up maybe some closing remarks, taking up some of those points or others that they'd like to pick up on. Who wants to start? Ishmael, would you?
I think just, again, picking up on the theme of, how censorship, I feel, from my experience, in particularly in the East African context where I know quite, when I travel, that it's certainly increased, that states there are able to censor, and I think the other point also about the link with, social movements and kind of, online kind of activity is really important, because you can't really affect social change and have sort of changes in these places if you solely on the web. You have to connect to social movements as well. Another final thing I think I'd pick up, which I didn't say, which Stephen picked up in his introduction, it's also about sort of surveillance and the ways in which the security services has, well, in Britain and also in the Americans, post 9/11 and post 7/7 have built up this amazing apparatus where people, British citizens, some of them, well, mostly naturalised British citizens in the UK, have been rendered in East Africa. They've some have ended up in the US. There've been secret, hearings in court, and you've had situations in London where MI5 has essentially, used blackmail to try and co-opt people to spy for them. So, that's also a danger, and that's a reaction, it seems, to what has happened and the kind of threat of terrorism. So I think that's another point that I just wanted to bring up that I didn't get to say at the beginning.
Okay. Shirley, would you?
It's very difficult because I think we are in the internet age. I don't see how can we unplug our lifestyle completely, going back to the romantic old time. I cannot see that. And although romantically I want that, I want to completely live nakedly in the cave, I'll be the first one. But then that means I'll be no job, no income, no any connection, and died lonely and starvation, because the system is built into our body with this the database system, So as we sit here, everybody is being databased, not in a physical format, it's on the internet. So how do we legalize the complicated, the vast, the chaotic, the internet behavior, legally and from the authority and in the civil society? I have nothing to say. I just found like we are swimming in the sea, but we don't know where is the sea. And that's this time.
Stephen, do you have some closing remarks? Might be interested to hear if you feel optimistic or pessimistic at this stage.
Well, I do feel optimistic, but I think there's a battle on. I think that you remember that they worked on the nuclear bomb a long time before they succeeded. At the moment, artificial intelligence is hopelessly failed science, and I hope it continues in that way. there have been billions and billions and billions spent on what some people in the States call total information awareness. It's what Amazon also works hard at, trying to gather and make use of all this information that is harvested both in corporate sphere and privately. They're not very good. They can look backwards but not forwards. The ability to predict new threats based on all the information, or even what you really want to spend your money on next, is very, very weak. And every computer scientist I've spoken to, emphasizes that point. It's not really working. But at the same time, it's the age of self-espionage. We are all writing, putting our lives online, adding to this vast database, making ourselves a commodity. And we're, sorry, I was supposed to be optimistic, but we just have to hope that the science on this occasion fails and people don't see it as their life mission to help the corporations, analyze our every move, because that information will then be put to effect also by the state. So the internet, I think, gives us a huge, and all the communications and science gives us great freedoms at the moment. But I hope that the sort of some people's crazy pipe dream of unifying all that information to provide this great monitoring system does not succeed.
Robert, optimistic?
Yeah, I'm an optimist. Obviously, there are a lot of threats, and we have to be very alert to these threats. And the threats that Stephen has talked about and have been alluded to. But I believe, we're all individuals, and and I believe in the human spirit. I think we believe we have a strong sense of independence within ourselves. This room is a living example of that. And so, in the end, I believe in the glass being half full. So, I'm thinking of the bar as we speak.
Right, I'm now going to ask Judith Hetherington to come up and make a few remarks. Judith also announcing the new Tim Hetherington Trust Liverpool John Moores University Index Fellowship and its winner. So, Judith. So there's going to be a short clip. I might be in the way. Oh, Stephen, you're attached.
I won't move then.
How did you get involved with the blind school in Sierra Leone?
I got involved there during the civil war in Liberia, and I turned up, and what had happened in Sierra Leone was that a rebel army, which was like a sort of cult, had invaded the city in January 99, and they killed 40,000 people. They ended up hacking off arms and legs off people, and it was pretty nasty. And I turned up during a ceasefire in July, and by chance, when I was there, I came across a blind school. And in the blind school were a number of kids who had been blinded by rebels. They'd melted plastic into their eyes, thinking it was a good idea. And the kids had also been evacuated from the school and come out. And I thought about the fact that if you are blind and people are having their arms and legs hacked off, it must be more terrifying than if you can see what you're doing and are able to escape. I realized that to make that kind of work on its own in Sierra Leone was very distant from our lives in Britain. So I made a connection with them with a blind. Okay. And what was interesting was that I started to act as a go-between, taking letters between the two children. And you have Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world, with, black kids, blind, from the poorest country, writing to predominantly white kids in the richest country in the world, one of the richest countries in the world. But they can't see each other. So race isn't an issue. And so it was interesting to see what they wrote about. And that really that was the basis for the project that continued for the next 5 years.
So what Tim also did,
many of you may know that Tim was brutally targeted and killed by Gaddafi forces on the 20th of April 2011. Gaddafi had given the orders to get rid of the journalist, the ultimate censor. A coroner in London in 2013 at Tim's inquest said that Tim was an identifiable photographer, a civilian in a war zone, just doing his job. And she had no hesitation in giving the verdict as unlawful killing. On Tim's death, we, his family, set up the Tim Hetherington Trust donating all in Tim's intellectual property to the trust to ensure, and I instinctively knew that I had to do something to ensure that some good came out of such a loss and to try and make some sense of the senseless. The trust objectives were widely written, the remit, so that we could help as many people as possible, struggling artist students, both here and in the third world. But also we want to encourage and educate others to follow in Tim's footsteps, to continue to bring humanitarian issues and social concerns to the forefront of the world. Tim understood that information is not enough on its own. He was never satisfied with information and sought always to immerse himself in his audience to achieve the most effective communication. You could say that his mission went beyond information. He was driven by a wish to share knowledge. He knew that the world cannot be expressed in data alone, and he sought to create as much context as possible to help people into the subject and then to engage with them intellectually and emotionally. He used any tool, using anything and everything to immerse people in a deep understanding. He never accepted the limitations of any medium and was always testing different combinations of visual, audio and the spoken word to help people feel the story. He specialized in long-term projects. In 2009-2010, he was embedded with the 173rd US Airborne in the Korongal Valley. And although he was in the big picture, his mission wasn't to report the big picture. It was to bring people into the intimate story so that people would begin to talk about the causes and effects of war. From that body of work, Tim produced photography, video, an Oscar-nominated film, Restrepo, a book, numerous interviews, and an installation called Sleeping Soldiers. I'm going to talk more about Tim at Liverpool University, John Moores Liverpool University, on the 28th, when I'm going to go into more depth on his methods and methodology. But tonight I'm here to thank and to congratulate John Moores Liverpool University and Index on Censorship for being so forward-thinking in sponsoring this fellowship in Tim's name, which the trustees are very, very grateful. I'm going to call on Chris Frost from Liverpool John Moores University to present the first Tim Hetherington Fellowship to Josie Timms. Josie, if you can come forward. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
Judith in the middle. Thank you very much. Smile at the camera. 3, 2, 1. I think I've just killed the flowers. Hang on. One more. 3, 2, 1.
Never mind, we'll do it later.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So now I'm going to ask David Aronovich to make a few final remarks.
Yes, what Rachel didn't want to tell you was that I'm going to ask for money. And she's now dressed it up in two different ways, once at the beginning and once at the end, as if that's not what I'm going to do. And actually that it kind of expresses something that I've learned the hard way, which is though talk may be cheap, free expression most certainly is not. It's actually expensive. Now, when I was first asked to be chair of Index on Censorship, I knew the organisation a bit, and actually I was the other end of the debate with Julian Assange, so I'm very glad to hear that the thought of my being thwarted in a debate was used as such a sort of enormous exercise of force upon the British government. And you can imagine them just sitting there saying, who's he debating with? David Aronovich. Better not get on the wrong side of him. And I like to think, anyway. It's not in any way true, but it was... so I was the other side of that debate, and a very interesting debate it was. And actually, it was full, that debate, of media students, some of whom were plainly enormously in love with Julian Assange. There was an incredible kind of erotic sub-atmosphere going on. So much so that every time I stood up, you could almost hear them, feel them thinking, sit down and shut up, we want to talk to Julian. Which you can understand. It was more understandable in the context of then, possibly, than people would think it is now. In any case, the main thing I've learned this evening is that free speech and good coffee go hand in hand. I learned that from the friend from Hungary, but I've learned a lot else besides. But the main thing I've learned as Index upon Censorship chair is that I don't just go swanning off to events and making kind of important speeches and swanking around saying I'm chair of Index on Censorship. I get to really think about what the organisation needs and what free speech and free expression need in terms of resources. One of the things the Index on Censorship does is it does encourage people now to become members. And if you were to be a member for as little as £5 a month, and it could be more, if you were to do that, then in that case, although you shouldn't need such an enticement, you would be eligible to get reductions in or early warning of or first refusal of some incredible range of tickets to events like this, and also our Stand Up for Satire type events and so on, which were an enormous success. But the main thing that you'd actually be doing is helping us organise for and advocate for free speech and free expression here in Britain, around Europe, and in those countries around the world, all the countries around the world, where freedom of expression and freedom of speech is under more direct threat, really, than we care sometimes to imagine. I'm thinking, let's say, of the bloggers of Bangladesh who find themselves under threat of their life or merely saying that they don't believe in God, which is, for some people, such a terrible thing, and other places as well. One of the things that Index does, for instance, in organising its awards evening, which as a member, of course, you get a lot of prior notice of, is it stays in touch with and encourages the people who are nominated for those awards. It keeps in touch with them. It keeps trying to encourage them and to learn from them and put them in touch with each other. So there becomes an increasing and growing network of confidence about freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So if you were to see Helen Galliano at the back, Helen, where are you? Helen's over there. And to fill out a pledge card and say, yes, I would like to be a member, that for us would be an incredibly positive result from what has already been, I think, a very interesting, successful evening. And from all of us at Index on Censorship and from the panel, we obviously thank the panel, we're really grateful that you came, and we would be even more grateful if you were to become members. Thank you.
And if anybody wants to go onto the party, see the Index staff at the back.